if A&M schemes are being designed based on sustained rating, where you have intermittent generation such as battery storage on there, solar PV, especially where there's clear evidence, potentially contracted capability of limiting the duration of battery storage, it seems incredibly pessimistic based on sustained ratings. And I think it's there again, something that needs to be looked at. And I feel like it's probably going to be a temporary element and that ultimately it will be solved over time. My concern is the damage that will happen first of people making investment decisions based on the sustained ratings, when actually if it was based on the cyclic ratings, it could significantly reduce their risk.
Hello and welcome to the Connectology Podcast. Here, Roadnight Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk.
Hello and welcome to another one of Roadnight Taylor's Grid News and Views episodes. I think this is episode number 6. So I'm Pete Aston and I'm joined by Philip Bale.
Hi, Pete.
Kyle Murchie.
Hi, Pete.
And Nikki Pillinger.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in and listening. So we've got a whole raft of subjects to talk through. As ever, I think this is possibly the biggest list yet. So we'll see how much we get through. So I'm going to go over to Nikki first, who wanted to talk about technical limits.
So just a quick update on technical limits. So we have had a few DNOs coming out with their Phase 1A reports. So SSE brought theirs out at the end of December, as did UKPN. Northern Power Grid have brought out some constraint reports, but we haven't had the formal variations yet. And NGESO have also sent out some of their 1A reports. However, the acceptance dates are quite variable. So NGESO, as an example, only gave 10 days to accept. UKPN and SSE gave quite a longer time. So just make sure, guys, that you're not assuming that these are the sort of standard 30-day variation terms, and make sure that you know what the stipulations are with your DNO. And any queries you've got, get them in super quickly because they appear to be quite inundated with them at the moment.
Okay, and so I'd sat in, I think maybe you did as well, Nikki, NPG's just a combined update with National Grid this week, I think it was, which showed all the sites that they were going to be doing under Phase 2 of technical limits. So Phase 2 is the more complex sites like infrastructure sites and other ones. So the DNOs are starting to publish timelines around that for how that's going to be rolled out this year as well. So lots to see with technical limits. Anything to say around some of the constraints and curtailment that we've seen coming out under technical limits?
So I've seen a few that have started to come out, and I think some of it very much depends on the luck of which GSP you're on, how much generation has previously been put through under Part 2, the diversity mix of the different generations. I've seen GSPs where there is no reverse power flow limits. Effectively, the limits are based on the import from the GSP, because previously there's not been considerable generation on Part 2, and that can have a massive skew on the level of curtailment risk, depending on where you are in that queue.
So some of these technical limits offers are going to look really good for some customers. For others, they're going to look very, very difficult to sort of invest on.
And then again, some of the technical limits are going to have different technical limits for different seasons for the GSP, sometimes different times of the day, whereas other technical limits for other GSPs will be sustained a 24/7, 365-day sort of limit for the GSP. So it will very much be on a case-by-case basis. The one thing I would say is any developer who's getting these, really try and understand what the assumptions are that are being used in the reports, because any curtailment report, technical limit report, is based on an assumption. Some of the assumptions are too pessimistic, some of them are too optimistic. They appear to be very different between different DNOs. So that's the key thing here, is sort of be aware of which DNO, what the assumptions are, how they've been doing the reports, and then ultimately what that means for your project.
And then I know, Philip, you had on the list of things, which I think is going to appropriate now, to talk about sort of data accuracy around LIFO queues and technical limits queues. So this is more around, is the curtailment limit, the constraint I've got in this report based on sensible, accurate information? I think you were going to pick up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we are seeing at times, and the deeper you dig into projects, sometimes you can find issues and errors where a project will be proceeding and then all of a sudden there's an update to a curtailment report and there appears there's more generation that's ahead in the queue because it was missed in the first report. Or equally, just seeing different lists of data with very different priorities of generation in there, and a need to be, for the DNOs in particular, to be very clear on data cleansing. So they have a very clear queue for generation that gets shared with customers so they can make sensible decisions on if their project should proceed. And it's very dangerous not to do that. And we are seeing issues and errors, which is sometimes beneficial, sometimes very detrimental.
I know I was looking at one scheme with you the other day where sort of the list of generation schemes in the technical limits form that came back seemed to sort of clash with lists of generation that you might find on the embedded capacity register and not being able to tie the two together. So it's quite difficult to actually check, isn't it, whether these are right or wrong?
Absolutely. I think there are completely different lists for these versus the embedded capacitor register. So it's almost impossible to go through and match with a high degree of confidence as to which scheme is where in terms of the list. And for some networks, the data is really poor, like around 50% accuracy. Most of them, thankfully, are far better than that.
Okay. Thank you, Philip. Kyle, I know you wanted to sort of talk briefly around that sort of transmission queue management milestones.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a podcast out that was published in December on that, so I won't go into too much detail. We'll also touch on it as well in another podcast that's going to go out shortly, which we recorded today, based on mod apps and agreements to vary. But no, just a quick mention that given that queue management rules are being applied at transmission level and milestones are being introduced, we do have a calculator that we produced and is available on the website for free. So do absolutely go and have a look, download it, play with it, do give us feedback. It's fairly straightforward, but effectively it's been designed to make sure that you know up front what your milestones are likely to look like, and also do a bit of a kind of cross-reference and check once you get the offers themselves.
And the two bits of information you need are your sort of anticipated offer issue date and your anticipated connection date. Is that?
Yep, offer date, when it's going to be issued to you, and your connection date. It does also cater for multiple stages. So if you have one offer date, but you have maybe 3 stages or 2 stages within the 2 completion dates, let's say, for different technologies, it can cater for that as well. So it'll give you a view of what your appendix Q should look like.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Kyle. I had a brief thing, just I think it came out this week or last week, just around the name of the new future system operator. So National Grid ESO is going to become NESO. So a huge change. Apart from the one word is changing is electricity to energy, isn't it? So it's going to be the National Energy System Operator, which I guess gives it that sort of broader, maybe cross-vector view. So it's going to be interesting to see how the NESO is going to develop. And I think it's due to come into force this summer, isn't it?
Yep,
I believe
that's right.
So it's going to become a public body, public corporation, and yeah, we'll look to see more announcements on that, I guess, as the year goes on. Nikki, I know you wanted to sort of bring up and flag to people's attention about a grid code modification that's potentially got big consequences.
Yes, so this has kind of been rumbling along in the background for quite a while now. It is GC0117, and it's looking at standardising the sizing for generators. So up in Scotland, in the 2 areas of Scotland and in England, we have different thresholds for sizing of large, medium embedded generators. What this is seeking to do, or one of the main things that it was trying to bring forward, is actually having the threshold for large as 10 megawatts. This would be quite significant because this would mean that you would have to participate in the balancing mechanism, which can be quite expensive and quite onerous for generators. So this has, as I said, been rumbling along, but it's going to consultation on the 12th of February. So that'll be open until the 5th of April. So do keep an eye out for that. I think the working group sort of didn't come to a decision, but they have come to a consensus that this very much needs further discussion. So yeah, that was kind of it on that. But yeah, make sure that you're aware of that and make sure that you respond if you think that's going to influence you.
I have interest, Nikki, on that. Is that being purely looked at for new connections, or would that be retrospectively applied to any connected party?
I'm not sure that's been clarified. That was one of the things that very much came up in that 2027 was a date that was sort of bandied around in terms of if you energize before 2027, then you won't. But if you energize after 27, then you will. Not sure where that's got to, but hopefully that will come out in a consultation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nikki. That's great. Now, Philip, I know you love a good A&M system and a good constraint analysis. So I think you wanted to raise an issue around the types of ratings that are being used in some A&M systems.
Yeah, absolutely. It's A&M has a lot of benefits in terms of allowing connections to use up the headroom that's within networks. One of the things we always say when you do curtailment assessment is you need to look at the A&M system that's being installed to understand how it will be operated, because ultimately the curtailment assessment should link very closely to the A&M scheme that's being installed. What we have seen in some instances is that the circuit ratings that are going to be used are based on the sustained rating. So basically, the rating of a circuit, if power to run through them 24/7, 365 days a year, rather than a cyclic rating where they would run a bit hotter for a period and then cool back down again. And that can allow you to have an increased rating on a network based on the fact that it gets hot and then gets cold again. If A&M schemes are being designed based on sustained rating, where you have intermittent generation, such as battery storage on there, solar PV, especially where there's clear evidence, potentially contracted capability of limiting the duration of battery storage, it seems incredibly pessimistic based on sustained ratings. And I think it's there again, something that needs to be looked at. There could be a few scenarios where sustained ratings are appropriate. Mainly it gets used where there's large industrial commercial users, data centers, very steady elements. But if networks are PV driven with peaky and intermittent generation, it feels like that might be overly pessimistic, which might cause people not to invest in schemes where eventually they might relax the ratings, go back to a cyclic rating, and then ultimately people's curtailment levels could drop considerably.
Do you think this is more of an issue for the curtailment reports or for what the ratings that are going to be put into the live systems?
I think it's the live systems, which then affects the curtailment reports, and I feel like it's probably going to be a temporary element, and that ultimately it will be solved over time. My concern is the damage that will happen first of people making investment decisions based on the sustained ratings, when actually if it was based on the cyclic ratings, it could significantly reduce their risk. The downside being is we don't know if and when the DNOs might end up changing their design policies to then go to a cyclic rating where it's appropriate. So it just adds uncertainty.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Philip. So I think that's, just a note of caution around curtailment reports and A&M, and even more reason to dig deep into the assumptions and so on around curtailment reports. Okay, thanks, Philip. That's great. So Kyle, I think you wanted to say something around National Grid's solutions for thermal constraints.
Yeah, so it was just a real quick one, just to mention that National Grid ESO have launched a Finding Solutions for Thermal Constraints group, and they're looking for feedback for the 29th, I think it is, of February. It's quite an open forum. It's effectively just looking for information fed back via a form. It does cover demand and generation, so it's looking at both levels of kind of constraint. The ultimate solution in the longer run may very much be reinforcement by the TOs, but it's acknowledging that in the short term, that's not going to happen. You can't overnight complete all that reinforcement. So what market mechanisms could be put in place to help facilitate the unblocking of constraints? So they're looking at it from a cost to GB perspective. It's very costly now, and it continues to increase year on year, the cost of constraints and payouts from the ESO on those constraints. So yeah, it's effectively looking at collating some ideas. So it's not specifically got to be a market mechanism. It could be other options, but if anyone's got any ideas, it's something we're looking at. But ESO is open to ideas.
So that's a group that developers could go and join if they wanted to sort of feed into that conversation?
Yeah, so initially, if you go online, look at it on their website. It's just known as Finding Solutions for Thermal Constraints, and there are 2 feedback forms, and effectively developers can put their thoughts on those forms and submit.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Kyle. I think that's an appropriate place for us to take a break, so we'll see you after the break.
I hope you're really enjoying this episode so far and are gaining a lot of very useful insight. If you're a new listener, I hope that you'll feel like you might come back. If so, make sure you hit the follow button and feel free to sign up to our newsletter, The Connectologist, at roadnighttailor.co.uk so you don't miss out on any of the podcast, webinars, case studies, thought pieces and explains.
Welcome back. So I now wanted to raise a point. So it was sort of towards the second half of last year that the ENA brought out their tactical solutions for battery schemes. So this was with a drive to try and make it easier to connect battery schemes onto the network. So tactical solution 1, which I know we did a podcast on last year, was all around the requirement for DNOs to offer batteries as non-firm connections in terms of their import, their demand element, which is probably positive because maybe some DNOs had been doing that, some hadn't. I think how DNOs are going to interpret that is going to be interesting to see as we get offers out this year. I have seen one offer from a DNO where intertrips have been required as opposed to A&M. So it's a sort of 2 feeders out from a GSP down to a BSP, customers connecting into one of the 2 132 kV circuits. There's an intertrip required on the battery for the outage of the other circuit that they're not connecting to, which, might be okay, but, could A&M have been more appropriate because there isn't actually any thermal constraint on that circuit as it stands. So, but there was an allowance within the recommendation for DNOs to be able to offer the constraint, even if there wasn't currently a constraint. But I think an A&M solution in that scenario might be more appropriate to allow at least some import during the outage of the other circuit.
I think it's a case-by-case assessment as to what's better, A&M and intertrip, and potentially if they end up getting used together. Obviously, the best scenario is not to trip the generation off altogether, and whether under certain scenarios, potentially storage needs to be slowed down to prevent the rapid change and overloads and set limits coming in. So it feels wrong to pre-curtail generation on the event that the circuit could trip out at any time, but also not the best solution to trip the generation off if the circuit runs abnormally, if there's headroom for there. So that's where I feel like eventually, especially for the big schemes where ultimately there's more finances available for finding the best solution, potentially a hybrid of both would work. One, to enable that the generation doesn't overload, or the import or export doesn't overload the network, causing cascade tripping. And number 2, ultimately people can utilize the most out of the network, so it's not being too pessimistic.
There does need to be consistency in costs across the DNOs as well in order for customers to make that decision. So as an example, the other day I saw a scheme that had A&M versus intertrip, and A&M was several hundreds of thousands of pounds. This is not the case in all of the DNOs, but there shouldn't be that disparity. It should be a viable option for customers that they don't have to consider is going to cost such an order of magnitude more.
Agreed. And I think some of it is some of the DNOs still trying to get their head around actual A&M delivery in practice. And over time, they'll learn more around what the actual cost of delivering it is. But as was mentioned earlier, the last thing we want is for customers to be scared off and not make the right decisions, and viable schemes not being taken up, and people making the wrong choices.
Okay, brilliant. So move on to Philip now. So this is probably an overlap between something that Philip and I both wanted to bring up, which is just around constraints for demand connections, mostly in the region of sort of transmission type constraints, where some demand connections are being held off for years and years and years while transmission works happen. Now, of course, we've already talked about technical limits for accelerating generation schemes, but that very specifically only applies to generation schemes. If you happen to be a demand connection in an area that is constrained for import, you've got no facility at present to accelerate your connection. So yeah, I think you wanted to sort of feed into that conversation as well, because it's really frustrating me.
Yeah, I think there again, this comes back to exactly what Nikki said around consistency. It's around trying to understand consistency. Obviously, parties should be treated fairly, but it raises a question of, if a developer is looking at doing EV charging hubs, which will help facilitate the electrical vehicle, people using them on the road, having more quick, rapid charges on the system, ultimately allowing us to decarbonise our transport sector, should they be delayed by 10 or 12 years for transmission reinforcement works? If you have industrial commercial customers where they're going to generate jobs and help the economy, should they be waiting 10, 12 years for transmission reinforcement? Obviously, it shouldn't just be a blanket, everything can go. There has to be understanding of what impact it has on everyone. But I think the questions need to be raised of what's material? What different scenario? What should be allowed to proceed? What shouldn't be allowed to proceed? What is the solutions that can allow the decarbonisation of GB to proceed as quickly as possible?
Especially as a lot of the import capacity has been taken by batteries, which have been obviously done to being installed to try and help accelerate our economy towards a net zero economy. So the two are sort of fighting against each other. And I guess for me, one of the frustrations is the fact that there's no longer a level playing field between demand and generation. So generation connections have at least an option of accelerating under technical limits. Okay, your curtailment might be massively high and you might not feel it's appropriate, but at least there's the option there. Whereas for a demand customer at the moment, there's just nothing. And so I personally, if you're listening, DNOs and ENA and National Grid, I think there needs to be a technical limits type process for demand. Maybe as Philip was saying, up to a certain materiality level or something, but something needs to be done to allow small demand connections to proceed.
I think the only thing we have seen is in West London, where obviously it is possible for ramped demand connections up to 999 kVA per year to go through, up to a maximum of 10 years for connections. The requirements for those are quite niche. It has to be more than a megawatt, less than 10 megawatts, has to be able to be rampable in their process. So it's quite a narrow area of projects that it will facilitate. But I think that sort of thing should be done everywhere, in the sense that it will unlock more capacities and then potentially also a little bit broader.
And of course, we touched earlier on the hydrogen podcast around kind of probably larger demand and particularly focusing a bit more on transmission. But aside from technical limits, there are quite a few other constraints and degrees of separation between how generation is treated and how demand is as well. So I think across the board, you now got the way securities are treated, the way that SQSS treats kind of generation differently from demand. That's quite a big barrier to a lot of the decarbonisation.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely one that the industry as a whole needs to, in my view, really kind of refocus on. There's been a lot of focus for batteries over the last few years, which has been the right thing to do, but now trying to solve those issues and remove those barriers to...
Yeah, well, it could well be now that sort of generation battery issue is maybe slowly starting to resolve itself with lots of focus and change over the last year or two. Maybe this year's the year for demand connections to come to the fore. With that in mind, Nikki, I know you want to just talk about regional developments.
Yeah, so one of the things that the new NESO is going to be incorporating is regional energy strategic planners. So they are going to be responsible for kind of joining up the energy system with local planning, with the DNOs, with broader government objectives. So we don't know a huge amount about this yet, but I think the role that they're going to have is going to be quite important. There's going to be 13 new bodies for these sort of regional system planners. They and frustratingly don't follow the DNOs. They tend to follow the Transport for England boundaries that we have at the moment. The people that are actually working in these sort of regional energy system planner roles, or RESPs, as they've been sort of abbreviated to, are going to be responsible for more of that, the multi-year planning and the sort of cross-vector planning between electricity and gas. And also planning and also sort of all of those bodies that feed into this. I think there was a general consensus when the government went out to consultation on this that there wasn't enough coordination and there needed to be a sort of central point by which planning was actually done and who actually had a sort of a full picture of what was happening. To my mind, the DNOs haven't been doing a bad job of that. They do engage with local councils very often. They do actually try and engage with developers to see what is going on in an area. So I think this is positive in a way. I also think having sort of one point of contact can almost dilute the expertise that you need sometimes. It'd be interesting to get everyone else's view on this in a minute. And there's also this sort of talk about prioritising and deprioritising projects based on what technologies and what is perceived to be needed in that area. I also think that it's kind of ignoring the fact that we've got this massive grid queue. Last news from NGESO last week was that we've now got 570 gigawatts of contracted capacity on the grid. And a lot of that isn't going to go anywhere very quickly. So we have to kind of marry up how all of this contracted capacity that we already have, that's already had a certain amount of investment in, then actually goes together with this more strategic energy system plan. Whereas we've had more of a market-based approach, we seem to be quite quickly moving towards a non-market-based approach. So yeah, for me, that's a kind of the elephant in the room in terms of, but we already have more, we have 5 times more solar and 5 times more storage capacity contracted than we actually need to meet net zero by 2050 goals. And that, to me, I'm not quite sure how it's going to line up with this more localized kind of planning, who prioritizes this? How is it prioritized?
I mean, I agree, Nikki, that there's a massive queue of generation coming through. And the bit that I always relate to is, in my previous role, I had a lot of people apply for connections to my license area. I had a fair number of acceptances come through. The amount of projects that actually got developed was a tiny fraction of the acceptances that came through. Do I expect that to increase beyond what I saw originally? Absolutely. Do I still think that we're going to get all of the queue actually building out? I still think it's going to be unlikely. We do a lot of red flag DD. We see projects, even some projects that get consented from planning, still can have some fairly substantial material issues in terms of the grid that gets missed and everything else. So having a queue that's accepted that is far bigger than what you actually need is standard. Been there, I think, for the last 10 years. There has been a cumulative queue that is far, far, far in excess of what the country currently needs in terms of its energy usage. But in reality, not all projects get accepted, or not all projects that are accepted get built out. And I think that just needs to be relooked at again in terms of a better estimation as to which projects will actually come to market.
And I guess that's what National Grid were trying to do when they were changing their construction planning assumptions, having the sort of attrition rates and, trying to build that in. I suspect some of that's going to come in a bit more maybe on the DNO side. We've got milestones coming in that's going to help transmission to try and help clear out schemes from that queue and so on. So we've gone through lots and lots today already. One last chance. Anything else from any of you guys to flag up? I think my brain's fried already. The listeners' brains are probably fried already. Okay, so I think that's probably it. We'll call it a day. Thank you everyone for listening, and we hope you tune in again for our next episode. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks all. Cheers. Bye.
Hey.
Thank you for taking your precious time to listen to this episode. Now, not everyone is ready to have a connectologist in their life. For others, it's just too expensive. And as our team is so small, we do have to be very selective in what work we take on. And that's why we put so much effort into these shows. We want our society to have the equitable energy system it needs in order to decarbonise and to thrive. So we want to help to topple as many connections barriers as we possibly can, in spite of our size. So please do feel free to ping a link to this episode to anyone you know who might be interested, because it would mean so much to everyone here.